Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So you asked for it and here I am. So the other week during my 20 bookish questions video, I mentioned being kind of tempted to do a video in which I went through the worst books that I had ever read and my thoughts about them, why it is I thought they were so bad. And safe to say, quite a few of you were really intrigued by that idea. I had a whole comment thread of different booktubers being like, yes, do this video. And Kieran from KD Books even did a poll on his Insta stories, which was overwhelmingly for yes, I should do this video. So here it is. Be careful what you wish for. Now, I've said in the past that I can be a little bit of a harsh reviewer, and I don't think that's necessarily that I instantly hate a book. I think it's more that I can very quickly be bored by a book, and it takes more to impress me rather than it being easy to disappoint me and to make me hate a book. I tend to two-star a lot of books, and for me, a two-star book is often a book that I just found boring rather than one that I hated. On Goodreads, for me, a one-star book is purely reserved for books that I hated, that I had a real problem with, and that I'm just like, nope. No. So the way that I'm going to do this video is that I am going to go onto my Goodreads account and I am just going to go through all of the one-star books. All of the books that in the 6 years in which I have had Goodreads, I have disliked so much as to only give them 1 star. Now, because some of these books I read like a very long time ago, I don't know how far these are going to be like very in-depth reviews on each of them. It may just be even a sentence for each of them, but I thought it would be interesting. And obviously I want to put out the disclaimer out there to say that just because I disliked a book does not mean that I think less of anybody who does like it. You know, this is totally all just personal preference. Now, when I've looked at the list of books that I have given 1 star to, I have noticed there are a couple of things here and there where I'm like, I'm not sure if that was necessarily fair. I don't know necessarily if I would give them 1 star if I was reading them now. For example, I can see that I gave The Tempest by William Shakespeare 1 star. Now, I don't think that was because I really hated that play. I think that was purely because I was kind of stress reading it for a module. I know that I read The Tempest as part of my module reading in my first year of university, and I was probably still kind of adjusting to the amount of work and the amount of reading that you have to do for a history degree. So, you know, stress reading is never good, and when it's Shakespeare as well, you should never stress read Shakespeare. Shakespeare should really never be read as one of a big pile of things that you have to read in a week. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think I actually read The Tempest whilst I was home from uni, so I was probably like, nah, I don't want to do anything that's going to interrupt my weekend at home. So I think that was a bit of an unfair one. That being said, I haven't read The Tempest since 2013, so we will see if that stands true. Another book that I gave 1 star to when I set up my Goodreads account back in 2014, I think it was Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. I have a weird relationship with the Twilight series in that I absolutely loved it, like 2008, 2009. I would have been about 13, 14 years old, and that was, I think, when the first film came out. And there were a couple of years there where me and my friends were so obsessed with Twilight, and I was definitely Team Jacob, I think purely because I thought Taylor Lautner was really hot. And then I went for a period of time when I was like 16, 17, where I decided that I despised Twilight and everything it stood for. So I think that was probably definitely seeping into me giving it a 1 star back when I was 18 and had Goodreads for the first time. Nowadays, I'm kind of like, I see there are a lot of problematic things in Twilight. It's definitely like not the best written thing in the world, and there are aspects of it that I'm like, but I also feel like I get a lot of comedy joy out of Twilight, especially from the films. I feel like if you put the Twilight films on and kind of watch them as a comedy rather than as a romance, oh, you can get so many hours of enjoyment from that. So yeah, I don't think it was fair for me to have given it 1 star back in 2014 because I don't think that is reflective of what that series like meant to my teenage years, but also not my favourite series in the world. So, and now into the proper 1 stars. I'm actually going to try and do this in chronological order of when I read these different books. So first up, the book that started it all, the first book that I ever thought, oh man, I hate this book. It is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. So I first had to read this book in 2011, 2012 as part of my A-level coursework. And I despise this book. So this is set in like a post-apocalyptic America where we are following a father and a son who are trying to survive in this barren, horrible landscape, which is just full of despair and cannibalism, and they're just basically trying to survive. I remember we had to read this alongside 1984 by George Orwell because we were discussing dystopian fiction, and I feel like hardly anybody in my class had a particularly good time with this. Obviously it is very bleak, and that probably didn't help matters at all, but also the fact that Cormac McCarthy decides during the process of writing this book that he isn't going to use proper punctuation. I think it was my first time coming across a book in which speech marks aren't used, and I was just kind of like, why'd you do this to me, Cormac? Why? And I think we were told by our English teacher that the fact that he doesn't use speech marks is intentional because, you know, like the speech blends into the rest of the text and that is representative and symbolic of how their days are just dreary and monotonous and everything blends into each other and it's bleak and grey and miserable. And I'm just like, but why? I just found it confusing. I didn't like it. And the whole thing is meant to be like this father-son relationship, and they frequently refer to each other as like they are the light carriers or something like that, that we are carrying the fire, and the fire is meant to symbolize hope. And I'm just like, shut up, stop being so pretentious. I know though for some people that they found this like such a profound, poignant book, and I just can't see it. I have said in the past that I am very, very tempted to reread this to see if I dislike it as much as I did the first time round, but I'm just not looking forward to it. Next up on this parade of books that I hate is Stargirl by Jory Spinelli. This is a YA book. I believe I read this in 2013, so when I just started university. And this was when I was first starting to try and get back into reading, and I was trying to pick up books that I'd heard a lot of people buzzing about. My sister happened to have a copy of this, so I was like, oh yeah, I've heard a lot of people say how great this is, I'll give this a go. I believe this is set in a high school, and it's all about this young boy who is not having a great time at school. He finds himself to be like not really well known and people don't really notice him. And then this girl called Stargirl comes to school, and she, you know, she is the quintessential not like other girls manic pixie dream girl, and it's the whole story about how people initially admire her because she's so quirky and different and she plays guitar in the canteen, and then eventually people start to turn on her, and it's this whole thing about high school popularity and how quickly the tide can turn. And I was just like, ugh. Maybe I shouldn't have read this so quickly after coming out of high school, or maybe I should have read it whilst I was still in high school, and then I would have found it like very appropriate for my life. But from where I stood, I just once again found it really, really pretentious, and I didn't like this manic pixie dream girl trope that I feel is just everywhere. I just found it getting really tedious, and I found myself getting bored by it. I actually note that I think they recently made a movie of this, and I feel like that's maybe 10 years too late, because I never feel like I hear people talking about this anymore. Like, why didn't they make it earlier? The next book that I gave 1 star to was More Than This by Patrick Ness. This is a book that I don't actually own a copy of because I picked it up from the library, and I believe that I read this right at the beginning of 2014. So once again, I was kind of trying to get back into reading. I was picking up a lot of things that I'd heard a lot of buzz about on BookTube, and for a lot of that was YA. And Patrick Ness particularly was a name that I kept on hearing crop up again and again. And I was kind of like playing around, experimenting, trying to work out what my taste is, and I think I realised very quickly that this is not it. I think it's kind of meant to have like science fiction-y Matrix kind of vibes, and if you know anything about my reading taste now, you'll know that's definitely not my thing. And I remember I just kind of found it a little bit bizarre but also boring at the same time. I remember not being particularly drawn to any of the characters, and for me like character development, strong characterization is a really big thing for me. I need my characters to be at least interesting if they're not sympathetic. Like I say, I don't remember this book very well, so I'm just going to read the Goodreads review that my 18-year-old self wrote, which Stella. So many people say that this is such a good book. I just really could not get into this book at all. There were no commas there, I will add, between such a good book and I just really could not get into this book at all. Great start. I didn't find the characters very compelling at all, and found myself barely skimming the pages for some reason. I rated Life, the Universe and Everything, which is by Douglas Adams, as 2 stars this year, and I didn't really like that book, but I at least had the mental energy to pay attention to what was going on, for the most part, which I just could not do with this book. Great. So apparently that's what I thought of that book. I did actually want to have a quick look at my Goodreads reviews prior to doing this video, because I don't typically write Goodreads reviews, but right at the beginning when I was starting to use Goodreads, I did try to write at least a couple of sentences, and I came across this one, which was for Coriolanus by William Shakespeare, which was not a book that I rated 1 star. I think I gave it 2 at the time, and which I find really, really funny because now I've recently reread it, and I watched the RSC production, or is it the National Theatre production with Tom Hiddleston, and I really, really enjoyed it. But back in 2015, when I initially had to read Coriolanus for my Shakespeare module, I really didn't like it, and I wrote on Goodreads, "Yeah, this is a bit of a crap review. I just simply didn't enjoy this play as much as others," in brackets. "Perhaps I don't get on with Shakespeare's later plays. I also wasn't a fan of The Tempest. I also miss soliloquies," again in brackets. "I did read criticism that the lack of soliloquy is to mimic the stoicism of classical characters like Aeneas and Odysseus, which makes sense, but it's just a personal preference." And then I go on to say, "I also don't think Odysseus is much of a stoic character. I think he's a whiny child, but what do I know?" All right, 19-year-old Charlotte, calm down. Which I find funny on two counts because, like, now I really like Coriolanus, and also I can't believe that I dissed Odysseus so much. Apparently, 19-year-old Charlotte found Odysseus in the Odyssey really whiny. What? And I actually recently reread the Odyssey through the Emily Wilson translation, and one of the things that I really liked when I read it this time round was the fact that Odysseus cries and that he shows emotion. You know, 25-year-old me think that's great, but apparently 19-year-old Charlotte was like, oh, he just cries all the time, he's so whiny. Okay, back into the actual 1-star books. The next book that I rated 1 star was A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Emma McBride. According to Goodreads, I read this between December 2014 and January 2015. It was the first book that I finished in 2015, and clearly I didn't like it very much. I actually think this book was my first exposure to stream of consciousness writing style, which you'll probably know I'm not a big fan of. It makes me very nervous because I just don't like it. It's not a writing style that I really get on with. The only time that I've ever really gotten on with stream of consciousness was when I listened to Virginia Woolf, but on audiobook. When it's audiobook, I can kind of make sense of it in my head. When I'm reading it on a page, I'm just like, what? The way that things are kind of like batting from one thought to the other, and I'm just like, no, just please, just tell me the story. Just tell me the story. Once again, just looking at my 2015 Goodreads review, I wrote, just a quick tip. If you are not used to / do not like stream of consciousness narrative, probably best to either skip this one or wait until you become more accustomed to that style. The plot was relatively straightforward, but the style in which it was written meant that you rarely get a chance to see really developed personalities. Everyone appears pretty caricatured and one note. What happens to the characters is devastating because the scenarios that happen are devastating, rather than you feeling for the pains that the characters themselves are going through, if that makes sense. I enjoy plot, I enjoy character development, I enjoy complete sentences. This book doesn't really do that a great deal. I understand its merits, but that doesn't necessarily mean I enjoy it personally. And then I end with, what a ramble. What a ramble indeed. I'm getting so much joy out of these really badly written reviews that 18, 19-year-old me wrote. And then in 2016, I gave 1 stars to On the Road by Jack Kerouac. I think this was one of the first books that I read after finishing university the first time. So I think I read this back in like October 2016. Honestly, I think it's all just a little bit of bad luck, but I seem to have a track record of not really getting on with books that were written kind of like between the 1930s, 1950s, maybe early 1960s. A lot of books that I've picked up from that kind of time period, I've just not loved. There are definitely exceptions to that. For example, like I really like 1984 An Animal Farm by George Orwell, but then there are other books from the time period that I've picked up and I've just found really dry and tedious. And I know that is completely not true and a complete simplification. Just because I've had a few bad books from that kind of 20-year period does not mean that all of them are bad. But I think once in your head you establish that something has become a pattern, you suddenly see it everywhere. And I think On the Road by Jack Kerouac was just like the worst of the lot for me. This for me was just a bunch of pretentious guys on their gap year, or at least the American equivalent of a bunch of lads on their gap year. I didn't really like any of the characters. I didn't really like any of the conversations they had. I was just like, no more, no more. And then when I look on my Goodreads review, it just has in asterisks, hides in hole whilst all the Kerouac fans throw stones at me. Yeah, I know a lot of people love this book, but it just didn't do anything for me. Next up, a 1-star book, which I know I've mentioned a couple of times on my channel already, is This Is What We Do by Tom Hanson. This is a book that I read in 2017 when I was doing work experience at Penguin Random House. I basically was given this I can't remember if it was to proofread or if it was going through the manuscript and kind of giving my thoughts on it, and my thoughts were overwhelmingly negative. Apparently this is meant to be Tom Hanson's take on The Stranger by Albert Camus. It's about a guy who lives in Paris and he's kind of like disillusioned with life and then suddenly gets caught up in like a crime ring or something. He meets this beautiful sex worker who's kind of like on the run from her pimp or something like that, and they get all caught up in drugs and crime, and I don't even know. But I remember finding it really pretentious. There's a lot of gratuitous violence and particularly sexual violence in this, which I just could not stomach. I think if I had to give the worst book of the lot to any of the books on this list, then it would be this. And you may be asking yourself, Charlotte, why do you own so many books that you don't like? And I have to say, I don't know. This has actually been on my own haul pile for ages, but I've just never gotten around to actually giving these books to a charity shop, and who knows when that day is going to come. Eventually. Next up for my 1-star books, we have The Wicked Cometh by Laura Carlin. I believe I read this, I think, it was either the tail end of 2017 or the tail end of 2018. I actually believe that I DNF'd this around 50 pages, but somehow thought it was a good idea to still give it 1 star. This is historical fiction. I believe it is set in 1831. I think it's kind of like a bit of mystery, a bit of crime. And I remember I just got 50 pages in and was finding myself just really, really bored. But not only that, I came across like a common complaint that I have with historical fiction, which is where the author just decides to hit you over the head with all of the research into a time period that they've done. And I think that authors think that they're really building the atmosphere by throwing all of these details, but a lot of it is just not necessary, and it just doesn't add to anything aside from to show the reader, look how much research that I've done. From what I remember of this book, she was very, very fond especially of using like late Georgian, early Victorian slang and just peppering the text with that, and I was like, does this really add anything? No. It just kind of clutters it up and makes it indecipherable. But that being said, you could very easily make the claim that I've not read the whole thing, so what do I know? But from what I remember seeing from other people, I saw quite a lot of people had meh reviews to this, so you know, I saved myself some time. The next 1-star book is one that I have talked about a couple of times. I feel like this one is probably going to be the most contentious, and also is the one that I can kind of understand why other people like it, but I myself just had issues with it, and that is Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. This is Dolly Alderton's memoirs, kind of like her teenage and early 20s. It's particularly about her relationships that she formed, both romantic but also the female friendships that she cultivated during this time. However, for me, I just felt like a lot of it was just about like her hedonistic lifestyle and all of the drugs that she took and all of the drinking that she did and all the parties she went to and all of the very, very irresponsible things that she did while she was really, really drunk. Despite the fact that a big theme within this book is meant to be like her female friendships and how lucky she was to have these friends, I felt so many times during this book like she just took advantage of her friends, that she really took them for granted and just treated them horribly. As I said in the past, it's probably just a case of like, this has not been my like university and 20s experience. I don't drink and I'm not really a partier, so I just don't get it. I just don't understand how people find getting blackout drunk enjoyable at all. It just, like, to me, it just makes me stressed and gives me anxiety just thinking about it. And I know I've mentioned it before, but there is a moment in this book where she has hit the limit of her overdraft but still decides to go get drunk and then goes to her friend's house from London to Oxford and makes her friend pay for her taxi, and she kind of depicts it as like, oh my god, look how wild and look how crazy I was, and don't you wish that you could be as crazy as I am too? And I'm like, no, you're a horrible person and you're treating your friends badly. Like, no, don't do this. Once again, I can see why other people like it. It just frustrated me on a lot of levels. Oh gosh, we're like 35 minutes into filming. It does take quite a lot of energy to be like this negative about books all of the time. I don't understand how people can do rant reviews. The penultimate book that I have given 1 star to is The Mermaid's Voice Returns, and this one by Amanda Lovelace. I believe this is the 3rd in Amanda Lovelace's poetry collections. The first one being The Princess Saves Herself in this one, which was one that I kind of liked. I think I gave it 3 stars when I read it. I feel like Amanda Lovelace's style is kind of reminiscent of Ruby Kaur. I feel like Ruby Kaur Milk and Honey is what a lot of people draw comparisons to. But I liked Ruby Kaur. I understand a lot of the criticisms that people have of her and, you know, having that question of, oh, is it real poetry? But I think that she has done a lot to get people into poetry. And what I like about her poetry style is that it's very, very few words, but every single one of them is deliberate. It always felt really, really intentional. And I think it just goes to show that you do not need your poem to be pages and pages long to have an impact on you. But I felt particularly in this that Amanda Lovelace was just pushing that as far as she could. You know, it's a lot of just like pressing the tab button for no reason that I can think of. Like, flight. Like, I fill my plate up and then I empty it again. These days, it's all for me. And I'm like, okay, right, was there a purpose to this? Into the rain and rode to my heart's content, because if anyone could be trusted to turn back from danger, it was me, wasn't it? And I just found myself losing patience with it. I feel like it was just pushing that gimmick to its limits, and I actually found myself like hysterically laughing at some points. So yeah, that one was just not for me. And then finally, the last book that I have rated 1 star, the book that I have rated 1 star most recently, and has been whilst I've been on my channel, it is the first 1 star that I have reviewed on this channel, is Longborn by Jo Baker. Oh, look at that. It goes with what I'm wearing. If you want my full thoughts on Longborn, then I will link I think it's my September wrap up where I talk about this. I know this is a book that a lot of people really, really love, but I had issues with it. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling from the perspectives of the servants at Longborn, which to me was a really, really interesting premise, and I was really keen to see what Jo Baker did with this. But I felt basically like after the first chapter, she kind of got that point across, you know, trying to get across this idea that during the Regency, not everybody's lives were as beautiful and pristine as maybe the middle and upper classes. Drinking tea and going to balls and wearing pretty gowns, that actually to have that lifestyle that they are accustomed to, there are a lot of people in the working class who are having a very difficult time of it, who are having to make their dinners, clean their muddy dresses, mop the floors. But I felt like after the very first chapter of this book, she'd kind of accomplished that goal, and then the rest of the book was not really her retelling Pride and Prejudice as so much as kind of like destroying Pride and Prejudice and kind of tearing down every single character in Pride and Prejudice and turning them into either caricatures of themselves or completely misrepresenting them. There was one particular plot point that I did not like, which is a spoilery one, so I'm not going to get into it here, but it was at that point that I was just like wanting to throw the book against the wall. And we are largely following a main character who is just so incredibly whiny. She just kind of complains about everything, and she's very flighty and flaky, but at the same time she sees herself as being like this very resilient, strong woman who like just gets on with life and just does stuff, and I'm like, no you don't, you whinge every moment that you can. So yeah, I didn't have a lot of patience with this book. Like I say, there are full thoughts in my wrap-up video, but in terms of Pride and Prejudice retellings, I much preferred things like Charlotte by Helen Moffat and The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. So yes, those are all of the books that I have ever rated 1 star. Like I say, I do think, as sparing as I am with giving a 5-star rating to a book, I think I'm more sparing in terms of what books I give 1 star to. I feel like a book really has to get under my skin for me to hate it that much. And I'm kind of glad I've got all of those thoughts out now. Like I say, it's kind of tiring to think about all of the reasons that you dislike a book. I find it so much more easy to gush about a book and to say how much I loved it than to try and tell people and explain and justify why I dislike a book. I've been filming this for 45 minutes. It's actually gone super dark. Like, let there be light. Do let me know what you think of any of these books. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know about books that you yourself have given 1 star to and really, really hate. Let's just have a little bit of a doom spiral together. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.